Okay, so today we'll be talking about mutation and selection. So over here we'll be learning about mutation as a change in the structure of a gene and also mutation in the form of the number of chromosome. So in your syllabus, there's only two types that you need to know. For the gene, it will be the sickle cell anemia, while the chromosomal number it will be your Down syndrome. So mutation occurs usually as a result of an error. This error, right, tends to be like maybe random and during the replication of the gene or the chromosome. But sometimes later on you will learn that some of this mutation can also be influenced by mutagens that can cause it to actually cause some form of mutation. So somatic mutations usually occur in the normal body cells that cannot be inherited, and that mutations may be inherited by the next generation if they occur in cells that give rise to gametes. Dominant mutations are usually easily detected, unlike recessive mutations which may not be detectable for generations. There are two types of mutation: chromosomal mutation. This is where there's the change in the structure or number of chromosome, and this causes Down syndrome. On the other hand, for gene mutation, there is a change in the structure of DNA, and this helps to produce variations between individuals as it results in new alleles of genes. The meaning of allele here means alternative forms of the gene, and it can cause albinism or sickle cell anemia. So for Down syndrome, humans normally have 46 chromosomes. In other words, actually it's 23 pairs of chromosomes in the body cells. People with Down syndromes will have 47 chromosome, and they have an extra copy of chromosome 21. For chromosome mutation, we have the Down syndrome, and this is where for chromosome mutations in the gametes of a female, the parents can actually produce a child with Down syndrome. And this is where we would see that for the male, you will actually split into two normal sperm cells, whereas for the female, one of the chromosomes will actually be transiting over, leading to a formation or fusion in the zygote, leading it to it having actually more of the chromosome and especially at chromosome 21. Albinism is basically a mutation, a gene mutation that is due to a result in a recessive allele, and the absence, and what basically albinism is actually the absence of this pigment melanin that results in the skin to be reddish white. You can also have white skin and also pink eyes. So albinos, they tend to get sunburn easily as they are very sensitive to sunlight. So an example is like the white tigers. White tigers are an example of albinism kind of genetics. Okay, sickle cell anemia, on the other hand, is the second type of gene mutation. This is caused by the mutation in the gene controlling hemoglobin production. So for the mutated gene, it's recessive, hence only expressed in homozygous recessive condition. For sickle-shaped red blood cells, they will have lower oxygen carrying capacity and they tend to clamp up together. This disease is fatal and the sufferers usually die young. So when we talk about sickle cell or sickle shaped red blood cell, right, what we meant is it actually has like a crescent kind or sickle shaped kind of red blood cells from the original where it's supposed to be a circular biconcave kind of red blood cells. And because of the reduction in the number of the sickle shaped red blood cells, they tend to actually not have a larger surface area to volume ratio and resulting in them actually having lower oxygen carrying capacity. So for sickle cell anemia, individuals who are heterozygous for the sickle cell allele are more resistant to malaria. Hence, heterozygous individuals are common in areas where malaria is prevalent, such as the West Africa. So what actually this means is for malaria, right, they tend to actually attack the red blood cell. And if you are having a very healthy red blood cell, a circular biconcave one, right, they tend to actually get infected of malaria and they can die off. On the other hand, for sickle cell anemia, right, because of its crescent of its sickle shape, the malaria bacteria is very hard to actually attack it. And because of that, right, the humans tends to actually have a higher survival rate. That means they don't die because of malaria. For countries that doesn't have malaria that often, then those patients who actually suffer on sickle cell anemia tends to die younger as compared to a healthy individual. So mutations can be harmful or beneficial. So individuals with harmful mutations will be eliminated, whereas individuals with beneficial mutations, on the other hand, may leave more offsprings than normal individuals. So nature actually selects this organism with more favorable characteristics to survive and reproduce. So this one is something like the show like X-Men and what's not, where X-Men you have a mutation in one of your gene and then suddenly you are able to heal over time. Isn't that a very beneficial mutation? So if you have this kind of beneficial mutation, you tend to of course live longer, reproduce more often as compared to those that don't have lah. So that's where you can see that nature will select this kind of characteristic even though it's a mutation. So next we look into mutagenic agents. So for mutagenic agents, right, or mutagens, there is two types. There's the radiation and chemicals. So radiation tends to be formed from like ultraviolet light, X-ray, alpha, beta radiation, gamma rays. So these are actually the ones that will cause you to have mutation. So gamma rays is usually used. I mean, they usually the movie Avengers, the Green Hulk, they tend to say it's always affected by gamma rays. So that's one example lah. But whether if you subject yourself to gamma rays and become the Hulk is another thing. I don't think that's really real lah. Yeah. Chemicals on the other hand are like mustane gas, formaldehydes, or LSD. So these are examples of mutagens. When you actually affect yourself, you will actually get all this. So this will actually greatly increase the rate of mutations. And in the absence of mutagen, rate of spontaneous mutation is actually very, very low. Next, we talk about selection, where over here we will have to understand that competition usually arises from variations will lead to the survival or even the reproduction by organisms best fitted to the environment. You are needed to know the environmental factors that can actually act on it and the importance of natural selection or examples of artificial selection. So variations in organism may arise due to crossing over and independent assortment of chromosomes and during meiosis, whereas mutation in the genetic material. Mutation provides new allele to the gene pool for the natural selection to act on, and that genetic variation is important to help organisms to adapt and survive in changing environments. Natural selection is this selection process that helps to ensure that the best adapted organisms in a population tends to survive to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. Nature selects varieties of such organisms that are more resistant to disease and are better adapt to changes in the environment. So this process by which present complex forms of living organisms have arise from simpler ancestral forms is what we call evolution. So over here we can actually see how certain one type of bird has actually formed different kinds of characteristics. So from the mouthpiece you could see of how they are actually able to feed on the different kinds of insects or food kind of areas lah. So some of the mechanisms of the mechanism of evolution is where organisms will reproduce rapidly as food supply is abundant. These organisms will migrate to different environments. Having spontaneous mutation takes place, resulting in variation in the organism, and favorable traits will confer a selective advantage, and such organisms will survive, reproduce, and pass on their favorable genes to their offspring. These organisms will then become the predominant species in their environment. So over here we can take a look at an example where plants and animals with desirable traits can be artificially selected through selective breeding. And through selective breeding, right, the breeders will first analyze the seed from different plants and select plants that produce seeds with high oil content. And in doing so, they are actually selecting plants with good gene combination. So what we can see is when I say selective breeding is basically you, the farmer or what, actually choose the characteristics of the plants or even animals that they want, and then from that they force it to actually propagate and um, um, to create even more of similar similar characteristics as their parents lah. So after many generation, right, this pure breeding, right, will produce seeds with just the desirable qualities being obtained, and these plants can then be self-pollinated to ensure the desirable genes are being inherited by basically the plant. So another example is, let's say you see a tree, two apple tree, one that is the taste of the apple is very sweet, the other one is that the outlook of the apple is very big and shiny. So what you want is by selecting the two kinds of apples, you try to do selective breeding such that from that you are able to actually grow a apple tree that may produce offspring with just big juicy sweet apple. Another example is like for fighting fish, whereby if let's say you got one of the fighting fish is actually red in color and another fighting fish that is white in color, and you want to have a fighting fish that is able to give some form of very nice intermediate color of red and white, then what you do is you breed these two fish together such that they actually give you that kind of characteristics of fish of the in between color. So then there is actually the need to actually be able to compare natural selection and artificial selection. So natural selection usually results from mutation in genes, whereas for artificial selection you tend to escalate it faster where the humans are the ones that will manipulate the gene selection. Natural selection is brought about by changes in the environmental condition, while artificial selection is where humans will select the organisms with desired traits to reproduce. For natural selection, it's a very slow process, while artificial selection is relatively faster to process. For natural selection, it is also more, it may be advantageous or harmful to man, whereas for artificial selection, it is generally advantageous to man because the man is the one does the selection. Okay, and that is all for this chapter. Do revise it. Thank you.